All right, so the last thing I want you guys to learn about in our unit on feeding the world and the ecological implications of doing so is to look at pesticides. This is certainly something that you've thought about in your life, but you may not know that much about. So let's fix that. Okay, so the idea is that when we try to grow plants, we have to consider several things. Farming is not that easy because there's a lot of things that can get in the way of plants being able to produce food for us. So we have to provide them with basically their needs, water being the main thing. So we irrigate them if it doesn't rain. They run out of nutrients, so we had to provide them with fertilizers, either in the form of chemical fertilizers or some other way of getting nutrients into the soil. But then there's other problems. So another problem is that there's other plants. Like if I clear a field and try to grow corn or whatever, there's other plants that are going to try to compete with it for light and space, and just having them there can make it very difficult to harvest a crop. So we need to try to prevent competition from other plants. And then the other thing is there are things that want to eat our plants other than us, namely insects for the most part. So there are pest species that try to eat our plants, like these caterpillars that you see here. And we've got to do something about those because otherwise we're not going to get to eat much food or feed very many people. And whether you like the fact or not, uh, pesticides are an essential part of having humans on the planet, at least at the levels they are at now, because if we didn't do anything to stop weeds and stop bugs from eating our crops, there wouldn't be a lot of crops to feed people. There'd be a lot of hungry people on this planet. Now, so how is it that we deal with these threats to our crops? The answer is we use what are called pesticides. Now, pesticide is just a catch-all term for an artificial chemical that you can put in your crop that is going to get rid of pests. Now, this pests could be plant species, they could be insect species, they could be fungal species, bacterial species, mammal species, whatever. So a catch-all term is pesticides. I would like to focus, though, on this in this discussion, mainly on two things. I listed three of them here, but I don't focus on two of them. I want to focus on insecticides, substances that kill insects, and on herbicides, substances that kill other plants that might compete with them, weeds. So here's how most insecticides are going to work. So basically, what happens is at a certain point in the growing year, a farmer's going to go and they're going to spray this chemical all over their plants. Now, these chemicals are essentially poisons, and most of them, but not all of them, work by disrupting nerve impulses, which basically make it impossible for the organism to continue to live. Very similar to nerve gas, actually. In fact, Adolf Hitler had developed nerve gases during World War II, and the rest of the Allies did not know about that. And we were kind of surprised that he didn't use them against us when we invaded Europe to try to get rid of Nazi Germany. He had them ready to go. He had them weaponized, but he thought we had them as well and didn't want to get into a nerve gas war with us. It turns out we didn't have nerve gases. We had discovered a type of chemical called DDT, which is a similar compound, an organophosphate. Anyway, just thought I'd point that out. Point being, pesticides and nerve gases being very similar. And Adolf Hitler making a very bad decision, which let the Allies win the war. So anyway, what happens is this. We can spray these things on our crop and we just kill them directly. The bug is on the plant. When the spray comes on it, it hits it, it dies. Another thing that happens is just secondary contact. I sprayed on the plant on the plants. It sits there, and then later on, a bug crawls on there. It goes to the bug's feet, and then the bug dies. Or the bug eats the plant, starts to eat the plant at least, and then it gets poisoned and dies before it can eat the rest of the leaf. So I don't lose my crop. In some cases, we just can put things on there that smell bad and make them leave. They don't like the smell of it. In fact, we can plant plants that do that. Chrysanthemums are very well known for being making a chemical that bugs find unpleasant and they leave. I can use a fumigant, and basically what that means is the bug doesn't have to touch it. It's going to vaporize, and then it literally is a nerve gas at that point. It's in the air. The bug breathes it in and dies. Or in some cases, we can use like a lure and kill method. Usually what this means is we're going to put in to the insecticide a pheromone, and a pheromone is essentially an attractant, often a sex attractant, with which these organisms find each other. But it could also be one where they communicate with each other. Hey, I found food. Come over here. And so basically you lure them in and then you poison them. Anyway, this is how insecticides typically work. Now, how do they get onto our crops? Well, we generally put them on as liquid droplets. It can be granules of solids, but usually it's liquid droplets, often applied by airplane or by farming equipment or by people walking through with spray cans. And I should point out that the amount of pesticide most people get exposed to is very, very low, and it's not clear to what extent they actually cause human health problems. Really, I mean, we know they're not good for us, but we really can't, differentiate what they do from other things we get exposed to. But that's not true for people who work in fields. So people who work, especially in developing countries, using pesticides, a lot of times their exposure is such that they have significant acute exposure problems. But let's just talk about exposure to pesticides. I'm sure your mom and maybe your dad, uh, they are concerned about you getting exposed to these chemicals. And especially the younger you get exposed to them, the more likely they are to cause harms. Now, as I said, we don't really know at the levels at which we're consuming these things how much damage they do to us. We know that they're probably not great for us, but we are complex organisms, and it's not like someone takes a bite out of a tomato and falls over dead from pesticides. It doesn't work like that. So when you have health problems, maybe it was because there's pesticides in your tomatoes. Maybe it's the air you were breathing from cars. Maybe it's just random chance of your DNA. We don't know, unfortunately. Um, but still, we're generally cautioned that it's probably best to go ahead and wash our produce before consuming it, right? That just means like take it in a sink, wash it, rub it, and dry it off before you eat it. That's the safest thing to do. Recent studies from some universities have shown an even better way is actually to have a container like a tub of some sort and put some baking soda and water and then just soak it for a little bit. They find that actually gets off even more of the residues. But some of the concerns we have apart from human ingestion of pesticides have to do with the rain and the wind sometimes carry these chemicals away from the farm, and they get into ponds and they get into streams, and they can kill not just insects there, but they can also kill amphibians and fish, either directly or by killing the insects that they were going to eat. So there's definitely been many instances of a farmer applying pesticides and then seeing a die-off of amphibians and fish species and reptile species in nearby ecosystems, especially habitats that are aquatic in nature, is where it really tends to happen. Also, they can biomagnify. This is something we're going to be talking about in our next screencast today. We're going to look at two screencasts. And biomagnification definitely is a problem that happens where we end up killing off higher order consumers with our pesticides that we use in fairly small quantities. Another problem that you may not think of, but this is an interesting one, is that the use of pesticides can reduce the productivity of soil, and the way it does that is by killing off the organisms in the soil that are important in terms of nutrient cycling, especially nitrogen-fixing bacteria and ammonification bacteria, ones that break down decaying matter back into the soil. So these pesticides don't just kill bugs; they also kill bacteria. They also kill decomposing organisms that live in the soil. And so there's definitely clear data that shows that excessive use of pesticides causes the soil to start being non-productive. Another one that's really a problem is that we often end up killing non-target species, especially if it's a windy day. So if you apply this directly on your crops, chances are the only thing you're going to kill if it's a still day is you're going to kill the organisms that are directly on your crops. But if the wind's blowing, then I spray my crops, but it drifts over to nearby wildlands, meadows, whatever, orchards, and it ends up killing, things like bees and butterflies and all these things that are actually quite useful, especially if they're pollinators, very useful members of the ecosystem. And if not, they're just part of the food chain. They're important to other organisms. So it can be very disruptive to neighboring ecosystems by accidentally killing off-target species. So, obviously the target species is the one you want to get rid of, like the worm, we call it worm, but it's a caterpillar. It's an insect larva that's eating your corn, for instance. Now, herbicides are the other pesticide I want to talk about. Okay, so weeds are pests. Okay, so herbicides are just weed killers, and basically what they do is they work by usually they target a particular enzyme in a plant, and they disrupt it somehow. So these are known as endocrine disruptors. They make hormones and enzymes not function, and so what happens, like the plant just grows and grows until it dies, or it loses its ability to bring in water. There's lots of different ways in which these can work, but the bottom line is it disrupts the metabolism of the plant and causes the plant to then die. And so the idea is you can have ones that are selective. They only work on specific kind of plants, but not on the kind you're growing. That's great, but that's not a very common thing. Usually, we have these non-selective or broad-spectrum herbicides, and they kill plants, right? And I just want to look at some of the issues associated with this right now. Okay, so often what happens is this: most of the herbicides that we use would kill both the weeds and the plants we want to grow. So what often happens is uh, farmers will put down what are called pre-emergent um, herbicides. So that means is often what we find is that the weed plants start to grow before our crop plants do. So timing is everything, and they put this out, and as the weeds start to come up, the weeds die, and then the herbicide is basically dissolves into the soil and is no longer in a form that's going to harm the new plants coming up, and then your crop plants come out. That's a very common way of doing it. But as I said, just before I said, we got to dissolve these things and kind of get them out of there, which they don't just go away. They go into the groundwater. Not great. Now, we're going to get to something that you're not going to like hearing about, but it's important. And that is how genetic modified organisms are coming into play, especially in terms of, well, both herbicides and pesticides. But a really big one is this one called Roundup Ready crops. So Roundup is a very, very popular and effective herbicide that's used both residentially in people's lawns and their gardens. It's used quite a bit by most, around the world. Monsanto came up with this, and it's like a hugely, hugely effective herbicide. But of course, it has a host of problems associated with it. Well, problem with it is it only kills when it gets on leaves. So it doesn't really work as very well as a pre-emergent one, right? They said the plants already have to be there. Well, what they came up with this idea is they said, look, there's certain plants that are not killed by this particular compound that's in Roundup. And so what they've done is they've genetically engineered certain crop plants, and there are lots of them. I mean, there's a lot of corn and cotton and beets and peas and on and on and on. Okay, and so what they do is they've spliced in a gene that gives them resistance to their own product. And so the idea is if you buy a seed from Monsanto for your corn, you plant this Roundup Ready corn, it grows, and now it's already up out of the ground, right? And here come the weeds. Guess what? You spray Roundup, you kill the weeds, but you don't kill your Roundup Ready plants. That's the idea behind it. And I mean, it is like taking off. People all over the world are using this because it is super effective at allowing you to grow plants that are free of weeds. Now let's just talk about the pros and cons. And I know most people, when you hear GMO, you're like, con, yeah, I'm against it. Okay, well, let's just back off for a second. Let's think about this. Okay, so let's just talk about the pros. You will definitely be able to produce more food when you don't have these weeds getting in the way of it, right? So and basically more food. What does that mean? Well, that means more people on the planet are eating. It means the farmers are making more money, and that's good. Okay, but here's the real thing that I want to stress to you. Okay, are you ready? It also means we don't need to till the soil, because one of the main reasons people till soil is to try to take those weeds that are at the surface ready to come up, and you fold them under. Now they don't have light, and so by folding them under, then you've got it to where those weeds are less likely to come up. You're going to give your crop plants a chance to outcompete them. But the thing about tilling soil is it exposes soil, it degrades the soil, it compacts soil. There's a real soil crisis on our planet. I mean, a serious, in our generation, we may run out of our ability to feed ourselves because of how much damage we're doing to the soil. Guess what? If you use Roundup Ready crops, and listen, I'm not invested in the cover anything like this. I mean, I'm like you. I'm like genetic organisms, Frankenfruit. I'm not for it. But the thing is, think in terms of if we can reduce soil erosion and soil degradation, that is huge. And so, that's one thing it does. Now, what are some of the cons? Okay, well, first one con is hey, we don't really know. We're messing with genomes, and how much we really know about what we're doing. So a lot of us is kind of like a sort of this gut feeling that it's wrong, but the data doesn't necessarily support that at this point. Who knows what we're going to find in the future, right? But a couple things. Okay, one of the big problems is just you're allowing this company Monsanto to basically control the world's agriculture, and so that means if you're going to plant, if you're going to do this, you got to buy seeds from that company and buy the herbicide from that company, and so you're basically making this monopoly. Now, the seeds that they grow are sterile, meaning that you can't take a seed off this corn and plant it and make a new corn. Right? But that's a good thing, because we don't want this. We don't want this genetically modified version of corn just kind of getting out into the world, right? So that's a good thing. So they do it to prevent what's called crossbreeding. But at the same time, it means that you can't save some of your crop and plant it for next year like people have always done. Every year you got to buy it from Monsanto. And the other thing is that if we do this, like, hey, if a little works good, maybe more works better. People use a lot of Roundup, and genetic variation being what it is, there are going to be some of these weeds that are resistant, and you end up with this an increased number of these weeds that are resistant to the particular Roundup herbicide. Now, before we talk about resistance, which I do want to talk about, I want to talk about another really important GMO, and that is what are called BT crops. Okay, so whereas Roundup Ready was about herbicides, BT is about pesticides and reducing the need for pesticides. So, excuse me. So BT basically comes from a soil bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, and basically they've taken a gene out of this particular soil bacteria, and it's a gene that is toxic to most of the insect larvae that might be eating our crops. And so by putting it in there, by splicing this into our plants, the if the bugs that would normally eat our crops eat it, they die. So it's like our plants are their own pesticides, but without using these chemicals that are harmful. There's no off target. So it's not a bad thing. So basically, what happens is when the organism eats it, it causes crystals to start growing in their digestive system, and basically blocks them from digesting food, so they die. But these crystals don't affect larger mammals, right? It only affects insects. So hey, it's like it's not like it's not going to poison you. It's not like a pesticide that's going to cause cancer or anything like that. So that's how it works. But again, it's like, yeah, we're modifying genes. A lot of us feel kind of like, are people really ready to do that? Well, let's just talk about the pros and cons. Okay. Pros first. Okay. So you're definitely going to get more, like with Roundup Ready, you're going to get more food growing. That means you're feeding more of the world's population, and that means more profit for the farmers, and that means more farmers, more food. You're not killing off-target species anymore, right? So it's not like a butterfly or a bee is not going to. Pollinators don't eat crops, so you're not killing them by accident. That's the real off-target species that's most problematic is pollinators. So it doesn't kill them, right? And again, it prevents soil degradation because I'm not putting chemicals on it that are going to end up killing soil bacteria. So remember, I need you to think of the importance of preserving the world's soil. It is a non-renewable resource that we have been degrading and eroding so fast in my lifetime, and we've got to stop it. And this is one way of doing that. The other thing is there's no runoff that carries this into neighboring waterways that kills the amphibians and plants. There's no biomagnification that's going to kill other things. It's not. It's not a substance that's harmful except those bugs that are eating it. Now, what are the cons? Well, again, farmers have to buy from the company that makes it. So you're given, and that means you're going to end up with reduced genetic biodiversity in the crops because they're only going to make this one kind. It's what's going to. Okay, I just got an email, but it didn't matter. So you're only raising one particular genome, and so that's going to limit you a bit. And the other thing too is over time, it's likely that the insects are going to start to develop resistance to this particular toxin, and then it may lose its effectiveness. But there's really not much we can do about that. So let's just talk about pesticide resistance. I've alluded to it a couple times. Let's just talk about how it works. I think you already know, but let's just go through it. Okay, so basically, it's just an example of natural selection, or I guess artificial selection. So the idea is that in any population of organisms, there's just random mutations of genes. Okay, so if you take like a insect larva that eats your crops, you know what? Some of them, just by random chance of mutations, have a gene that makes them less likely to die when they're exposed to the particular pesticide you spray. It's just random, okay? And so what happens is, here's the population. The red ones are the ones that just randomly happen to have this one gene, okay? Now, I spray the pesticide, and the blue ones that don't have the resistance, they die at a much higher rate than the red ones because the red ones are resistant, so they're less likely to die. And so when they all repopulate, notice that the population became more. It has a higher proportion of the resistant ones than it started with. We spray again, same thing happens, and over time, when I keep doing this, the genome of the population just becomes more and more and more skewed towards having this particular resistance. Just an example of what was called positive selective pressure. Okay, so positive selective pressure, it is you are more likely to survive and reproduce if you're resistant to that gene. So therefore, that gene becomes more prevalent in the gene pool. Now, there's a thing called the pesticide treadmill effect, and people see this all the time, and it's a concern, right? Because what happens is this: okay, so you apply a pesticide to your crops. Okay, so you got these bugs in your crops. So I'm going to spray them. I spray my crops. Well, they don't all die. Some of them don't. The ones that don't die are the ones that have this gene for resistance. So they become more prevalent in the population. So the next time you apply pesticides, you don't kill as many of them. So what's your response? I'm going to put more pesticide on there. Okay, well, it works a little bit, but then you end up with even more resistant ones. And so the next time around, you're like, I got to spray it. So people just end up using more and more and more pesticide because their population of organisms is becoming more and more resistant to it. This is not a good situation. Now, one solution to all of this is called integrated pest management. I'll just look at it from the insecticides perspective. It's a whole topic on its own. But IPM, or integrated pest management, basically what it comes down to is this: hey, instead of just randomly going out and spraying my crops, why don't I investigate, collect some data, and determine like when is it actually the right time to use pesticides? We're not, and do I even need to use pesticides? So basically, there's other options, right? But let's just look at the pesticide options. So if I just maybe plant in a way where I'm less likely to get an outbreak, like planting multiple crops in the same field, because an organism that might infest the corn, if there's soybean in between, it may not go across the soybean to the other corn, so it might infest one strip of corn, not the other one. It definitely happens. Okay, so that's called intercropping. That's a great way of doing it. That's one type of IPM. Another, but one of the main ones is just collect data, like put out traps and just see, or just go and inspect your fields to see like what is the population of pests right now. I don't. If there's not a lot of pests, don't spray. Wait until the population of pests has started to rise to a point where you're concerned about it, then spray. So by doing that, you're basically greatly reducing how much pesticide you use, how often you use it, and how likely it is that these organisms are going to become resistant. So just by being a little smarter about it, collecting a little bit of data, being less random about it, you can greatly, greatly reduce the negative impacts of pesticide use. You're not saying you're not using it at all. You're just using it in a more targeted, data-driven way. Another thing we can do is, I thought this was a picture, but I guess this is just a painting, but it's a pretty good one. All right. So you can also use predator species. So that you can say, hey, you know what, I'm just going to release ladybugs. They seem like really friendly little bugs, but actually they're killers, right? They eat these things called aphids, which are notorious for destroying a lot of crops. You can also have like parasitic wasps that lay eggs in caterpillars, which then kill them. So there's definitely non pesticide methods of reducing pest populations, but only really works if you're really targeting what exactly is infesting your field. Is the population manageable with this non-pesticide biological predator method? If so, use it. If not, go for the pesticide. So that's what IPM is all about. It's about making decisions based on data. Now, I'm going to end with the slide here. Okay, look, so many people are going to be like anti-pesticides. Pesticides bad. Okay, and I'm with you there. But listen, consider this. This is how much land for agricultural purposes has changed in the course of like from my lifetime, right? I was born in 1962. It hasn't changed, people. It's not like we're getting more farmland. We're just not, okay? But look what's happened to the amount of people on the planet. It has risen dramatically. We should all be starving to death. Like there should not be the people on the planet that there is. Why are we here? Because we've been able to get our this is just looking at what are called cereals. That's like rice and wheat and things like that. But we've been able to keep up and exceed human population, and we've largely been able to do that because we have access to herbicides and pesticides. If it wasn't for that, this red line and this blue line would be below this gray line, and that means people would be starving to death. There'd be famine all over the planet, basically the green revolution happened when we looked at this and said, "Hey, we got to do something to deal with the fact that we're not getting any more land, but we're definitely getting more people. So we're going to need more food without having more land." And that was one way of doing it. Hey, thanks for watching.